Hey guys, tonight we are stepping quietly into the soft torchlit courtyards of a medieval court, the kind of place where the air smells faintly of beeswax, roasted meats, and too many damp wool cloaks packed into one echoing hall. Picture yourself here. Stone walls, fluttering banners, and somewhere in the shadows, a young squire tucking a folded piece of parchment deep into his sleeve. That parchment isn't a battle order nor a financial ledger. It's a love letter. And you're about to find out why these little notes, though often sweet and silly, could cause embarrassingly tiny scandals that made whole courts chuckle, sigh, or sometimes blush. You probably wouldn't survive a week in this place. Between the drafty rooms, the bad wine, and the nonstop gossip, you'd be sniffling and exhausted by Tuesday. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know. Drop your location and the local time down below. It's always fun to see where and when you're tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the great hall, the wooden planks creaking under your boots. Courtiers bustle about, pages running with trays, noble women whispering under veils, and the inevitable cluster of knights trying to look more heroic than their neighbors. Yet amid the swirl of politics, feasts, and religious rituals, one fragile object carries more danger than a drawn sword: a folded ladder inked with words of affection. Love letters in the Middle Ages were rarely just about love. They were currency, sometimes bribes, sometimes risks, and always gossip. A knight might write to a lady of higher status, careful to lace his lines with both humility and flattery. Your eyes shine brighter than the morning star, and my sword is but dust at your feet. Sweet, but also towing the dangerous line of disrespecting her family's honor. If discovered, such a note could tumble into scandal faster than spilled wine across the banquet table. You picture yourself picking one up, the parchment rough, the ink smudged by nervous fingers. It smells faintly of smoke from the scribe's candle. And here's the quirky detail. Many of these notes weren't handwritten by the lovers themselves. Not everyone could write, so scribes, often clerks in service to the church, were employed to compose them. Imagine paying a monk to draft your love confession only for that same monk to chuckle and whisper about it during evening prayers. Historians still argue whether these clerics felt guilty, amused, or perhaps secretly flattered by their role as Cupid's ghostwriter. But the real scandal begins not in the writing, but in the reading. Letters had to be carried, slipped through halls, hidden beneath bread loaves in kitchens, or smuggled by servants trained in discretion. Except, servants weren't always discreet. One misstep, one wrongly delivered note, and suddenly your "to my beloved lady" ends up in the hands of her husband, or worse, her mother. Picture the flush on a young knight's face as the hall erupts in laughter over a misdelivered sonnet comparing a lady's cheeks to cherries. You lean against a stone wall, watching it unfold. A letter meant for Lady Marguerite slides across the wrong lap at a feast. Whispers buzz, goblets pause midair, and even the musicians slow their playing to catch the whispers. Tiny court scandals weren't always dramatic. They were deliciously embarrassing. And in a culture where reputation mattered as much as armor, even a love note could bruise a career. The great irony is how tenderly these letters were preserved. Some were tucked away in family chests, rediscovered centuries later. Others became examples in medieval rhetoric, manuals, how not to embarrass yourself in public. And a few, surprisingly, were copied into song by wandering troubadours, giving your private blush the chance to echo across Europe. So here you stand, candlelight flickering, parchment crinkling between anxious fingers, and all around you the sense that one wrong word could spark whispers for months. And you realize you're in the middle of a world where romance is written in ink, but scandal is shouted in laughter. You linger in the corridor now, your fingertips brushing the rough limestone wall, and you notice something peculiar about the letter you've just imagined being passed along. The words aren't always straightforward. Medieval love letters were riddled with secret codes, riddles, and carefully disguised phrases. Why? Because in a hall full of sharp eyes and sharper tongues, plain declarations like, "I adore you," could get you banished from court faster than you could say quill. So lovers disguised their thoughts. A lady might write, "The falcon flies at dawn," which to anyone else sounds like a tedious hunting update. But to the recipient, it was a sly signal. "Meet me by the garden gate at sunrise." Historians still argue whether some of these cryptic lines were deliberate codes or simply clumsy metaphors, but you suspect at least half the fun was in making the words unreadable to nosy onlookers. You picture a knight hunched over his writing desk, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth, carefully sketching little symbols in the margins. Perhaps he adds a tiny heart-shaped doodle, a rarity in medieval manuscripts, or even a crude attempt at drawing a flower. To the trained eye, these little embellishments carried more weight than entire paragraphs. A heart in the corner meant passion. A daisy might mean loyalty. And if the ink blotched, well, that could mean nervousness or just a bad quill. Scholars today still debate which was more likely. There's humor in this, too. Imagine a servant intercepting a note and reading aloud to the kitchen staff, "The cheese ripens as the moon wanes." To the crowd, it's nonsense. To the intended lover, it's a whispered reminder that their next meeting is just days away. The poor servant, however, thinks their master has developed a suspicious obsession with dairy. You can practically hear the givels echoing off the stone floors. The codes weren't only in words. Sometimes the parchment itself played tricks. Letters might be folded in specific patterns, a triangle meaning secrecy, a square meaning openness. Others were stitched shut with thread, requiring scissors or a sharp knife to open. And then there's the quirky tidbit. Invisible ink, made from lemon juice or even milk, existed in rudimentary form during the Middle Ages. Heat the parchment over a flame, and suddenly the bland poem about birds revealed an extra line. "Tonight, in the orchard." Romantic? Yes. Risky? Absolutely. Try explaining to a suspicious father why his daughter's letter smells faintly of singed dairy. And then there are acrostics, where the first letter of each line spells out a name. Picture Lady Beatrice receiving a poem praising beauty, eloquence, and tender innocence, radiant Countess evermore. Seems flattering until her jealous cousin realizes the vertical letters spell Beatrice. Scandal. Not because the affection itself was shocking, but now the whole household could puzzle it out like a game, and nothing spreads faster in a medieval court than a joke. As you walk through the hall, you imagine small clusters of nobles chuckling over riddled phrases. Some shake their heads, muttering, "Children playing at love." Others quietly envy the creativity. After all, in a world of rigid etiquette and endless rules about who may sit where, wear what, or eat when, the love letter was one of the few arenas for playful rebellion. One knight, recorded in a forgotten chronicle, wrote a line that still puzzles historians. "The goose knows where the river bends." Was it a secret code for a meeting, a private joke, or simply an awkward man trying too hard? Nobody knows. But that single line, preserved in ink, proves that medieval romance often teetered on the edge of comedy. You can almost hear the sighs of young men, hunched over parchment, muttering to themselves, "Does she like riddles? Will she laugh, or will she think I'm a goose?" These tiny uncertainties made every coded message both thrilling and terrifying. And you, drifting through this candlelit hall, begin to understand why each folded slip of parchment could flutter like a butterfly into scandal. Words weren't just words. They were puzzles, risks, and invitations all at once. And whether the message was cracked by the wrong pair of eyes or simply misunderstood, the result was often the same. Laughter, whispers, and a tiny scandal blooming in the corner of the court like ivy climbing a stone wall.
You find yourself wandering away from the flickering torchlight of the main hall and into the quieter passageways where the real business of love letters unfolds, not in grand speeches, but in hurried exchanges between nervous hands. Servants are everywhere, carrying jugs of ale, sweeping rushes from the floor, balancing trays of roasted pigeons. Yet, in this humming hive of activity, they are also the secret lifeline of forbidden romance. Without them, no letter could travel. And without letters, half the tiny scandals of court would never have bloomed at all. Picture it. A young scullery maid, barely 15, slips a folded piece of parchment beneath a platter of sweetmeats. She pretends it's nothing, her face carefully blank, though her heart thumps as loudly as the kitchen hammers beating dough. At the other end of the hall, a lady-in-waiting deftly retrieves the note while pretending to adjust her veil. To any casual observer, it's just the endless shuffle of servants. But to the people exchanging glances, it's the moment their whole day revolves around. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Servants often acted as intermediaries in courtly romance, partly because their movements went unnoticed and partly because their livelihoods depended on discretion. Yet the quirky tidbit is this. Many servants charged fees for such postal services. Some accepted coins, others demanded favors like an extra helping of goose at supper. Historians still argue whether these go-betweens did it for loyalty or profit, but you can imagine them quietly tallying their own little fortunes letter by letter. Now, imagine the risks. Servants caught delivering love notes might face punishments as small as scolding or as large as being dismissed outright. A cook once complained in a record that her assistant was too distracted by nightly nonsense because he kept sneaking folded scraps of parchment into the bread loaves. You can't help but grin at the thought of a nobleman pulling apart a crusty roll at dinner, hoping for warm butter, and instead finding a shaky sonnet. And of course, things didn't always go smoothly. One harried page once delivered the wrong letter to the wrong chamber. Instead of the intended, "My heart is thine" in secret, a visiting bishop received the note. His reaction is lost to history, but you can picture the scandalized cough, the long pause, and the discreet decision never to mention it again. It's tempting to imagine the servants enjoying the game as much as their masters. After all, if you're sweeping rushes in the hall all day, wouldn't you sneak a peek at the folded parchment? You might find syrupy rhymes that make you gag or clever jokes that make you chuckle under your breath. One recorded servant even left a mischievous reply of his own before passing the letter along. Imagine a knight opening what he thinks is a declaration of love, only to read, "Your nose resembles a turnip." Now that's a scandal, albeit a very tiny, very funny one. You follow the trail of a servant now, her soft shoes padding along corridors, past tapestries, past the smell of candle smoke and damp stone. She pauses by a stairwell, pretending to tie her apron, and then deftly slips a folded note into a waiting hand. For a heartbeat, the entire court seems to hold its breath. Will anyone notice? Will someone snatch it away? Or will the secret message survive the perilous journey intact? It's no wonder that so many medieval love letters were lost. Fire, damp, and the carelessness of messengers claimed countless notes. And maybe that was for the best. Fewer embarrassing love poems cluttering up the family archives, fewer cousins reading aloud at feasts for a laugh. Yet enough survived to prove this whole risky relay system existed and thrived. As you lean in a doorway, watching the scene play out, you realize the servants weren't just background characters. They were the arteries of the court's secret heartbeat. Every blush, every flutter of parchment, every tiny scandal owed its existence to these quiet, unnoticed hands. And if you think about it, their job was a medieval version of today's text delivery service, except slower, riskier, and far more likely to end with your love note being read aloud while someone else chewed on pigeon pie.
You step deeper into the court, where the flicker of firelight glints off goblets and polished plates, and you notice something delicate but telling: the wax seals on the letters. Tiny blobs of hardened wax pressed with rings, stamps, or improvised marks, the medieval equivalent of a password lock. You crouch closer to watch a scribe drip crimson wax onto a fold, then press it with a carved signet. A heart, a cross, were the emblem of a family. Once the wax hardened, the letter was supposed to be private, secure, untouchable. Supposed to be. But you know how curiosity works, and so did the courtiers. Break the seal, peek at the words, then reseal it with a dab of hot wax and a careful hand. If you're imagining someone nervously trying to recreate a nobleman's signet ring using bread dough, you're not wrong. That trick actually shows up in scattered medieval anecdotes. Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerations, but the idea that servants or rivals faked seals makes the court sound like a slow-motion spy thriller. Think about the scandal risk. A knight's letter sealed with a rose emblem, broken before it reached his lady, suddenly becomes common property. Servants whisper about it in kitchens, and the lady receives the note later, puzzled at the messy seal. She wonders, who saw this before me? Who knows my secret? That flicker of suspicion could be enough to sour entire alliances. The wax itself carried symbolism. Red meant passion, green sometimes implied hope, and plain brown was seen as practical, like sending a letter in a cardboard box rather than a velvet pouch. You can almost hear a noble sighing, "He sealed it in brown, how dreadfully boring." Yet these tiny choices created layers of meaning, subtle enough to fuel hours of court gossip. Here's a quirky detail for you. Not all seals survived transport. Couriers complained that warm weather melted wax, so by the time a letter arrived, it looked like someone had squashed a cherry tart against the parchment. One poor knight supposedly accused his rival of tampering with his love note, only to discover it had simply been too close to the castle's kitchen hearth. His rival never bothered correcting the misunderstanding, because what's better fuel for scandal than suspicion? And sometimes, seals really were broken on purpose. Imagine a bored steward finding a folded note, too curious to resist. He cracks it open, chuckles at the syrupy lines comparing Lady Isabel's eyes to two polished onyxes, then carefully presses it shut again. By the time it reaches Isabel, 3 different people have already shared the best jokes from the letter. The secret is no longer a secret, it's public theater. Even monarchs got involved. Kings and queens often insisted on intercepting or supervising correspondence. Some genuinely worried about treason, but others clearly enjoyed the voyeuristic thrill of watching love unfold in clumsy metaphors. You can picture a king chuckling over a knight's shaky verse and remarking, "If this is his poetry, I dread to hear his speeches." The poor knight had no idea his private affection had just become royal comedy. As you walk past a writing desk, you spot half-burned candles, ink stains, and a pile of used seals tossed aside. Each one was a promise of privacy, broken or intact. Each one carried the potential for whispers in the hall. You realize the seal wasn't just wax. It was a symbol of trust. To find it broken was a scandal in itself, a quiet violation that could spark feuds, ruined friendships, or endless jokes at banquets. And so the humble wax blob, meant to protect lovers' words, became yet another stage for the court's favorite pastime, gossip. As you lean against the wall, listening to the faint laughter echoing through the chambers, you can't help but think, privacy never really stood a chance here. In this world of prying eyes and eager tongues, even a melted piece of wax was enough to ignite a tiny storm.
You drift back toward the writing tables, where a thin rushlight candle burns down to a nub and ink pots sit half-clogged with dust. Here, in the soft scratch of quills, you catch another layer of the story, the languages of love. Letters weren't confined to one tongue. Latin, French, and even rough local dialects tumbled together on the parchment like mismatched embroidery threads, each choice carrying its own risks and comedy. A night might begin in solemn Latin, "Amor vincit omnia," love conquers all, only to slide awkwardly into clunky French for the next line because it simply sounded more romantic. Then, halfway through, he panics and throws in a clumsy doodle of a flower because he's run out of vocabulary. Historians still argue whether these strange linguistic mashups were deliberate attempts to impress or simply the blunders of half-educated nobles. Either way, they left behind letters that read less like smooth poetry and more like patchwork quilts. You can imagine Lady Catherine receiving such a letter. She tilts her head, eyes narrowing at the mix of languages, Latin for the opening, French for the compliments, and then, inexplicably, a line in English comparing her lips to strawberries red. Romantic, perhaps. Confusing, absolutely. She probably chuckled before carefully tucking the parchment into her sleeve. The choice of language mattered. Latin, the language of the church, was formal and safe, the kind of thing that could be defended as mere scholarly practice if discovered. French, especially in England, carried a whiff of sophistication and courtliness. Vernacular languages, though, were intimate, personal, and slightly scandalous. To write in your shared native tongue was to drop the mask and speak directly. That little act of honesty carried more weight than any Latin flourish. Then there were the doodles. Yes, even medieval nobles scribbled in the margins. Birds, hearts, clumsy sketches of castles. In one surviving letter, a nobleman drew a pair of eyes with rays shooting out of them, as if to say, "I can't stop looking at you." The drawing looks more like a startled owl than a romantic metaphor, but you have to admire the effort. Another lover scribbled a fish in the corner, which may have meant fertility, or perhaps he just liked fish. Historians still debate that one. And think about the scribes, those weary clerks hired to write the letters. Some were masters of multiple languages and could make transitions seamless. Others clearly struggled, leaving behind sentences that wobble between dialects like a drunk at a feast. You can almost hear a scribe muttering, "Does he want this in Latin or French? I'll use both and hope she finds it charming." The comedy here is that these linguistic mashups sometimes sparked their own mini-scandals. If a courtier misused a phrase, rivals would pounce. Imagine someone writing, "Vous êtes ma chandelle," intending "you are my candle," but accidentally implying "you are my tallow stick." Within hours, the court poets are rhyming about Lady Tallow Stick, and suddenly a private love note becomes a banquet joke. Tiny, ridiculous, but in a hall starved for entertainment, this was gold. And the ladies weren't immune. Some composed responses in flawless Latin, showing off their education. Others answered in cheeky local dialects, daring their suitors to keep up. One famous noblewoman wrote back entirely in riddles, forcing her poor admirer to consult half the court before realizing she had simply written yes. Imagine the scandalous laughter when that story spread. You lean closer to the candle, the parchment glowing faintly in the golden light. Every blot, every mismatched phrase, every scribbled flower carried not just affection, but the risk of mockery. In a world obsessed with appearances, nothing was funnier or more dangerous than a clumsy metaphor read out loud in the wrong company. So you linger here, surrounded by ink-stained tables and piles of parchment, realizing that these letters weren't just declarations of love. They were juggling acts, balancing languages, humor, and secrecy, each word chosen as carefully as a step across a frozen moat. And when one step cracked, when one phrase fell flat, the splash of scandal rippled through the hall for everyone to enjoy.
You glance down a narrow passage, the floor cold beneath your boots, and realize the scribe's role in love letters wasn't purely mechanical. Some scribes acted almost as matchmakers or mischievous intermediaries. They whispered suggestions into the knight's ear, perhaps add a line about the moonlight in her garden. Very poetic, very scandalous. Sometimes they added their own flourish, a joke in the margin, a doodle of a bird, or even a subtle exaggeration about a lover's virtues. Historians still argue whether these scribes were being helpful, playful, or just enjoying their own little theater. You imagine a timid nobleman handing over a crumpled piece of parchment to a sly scribe, eyes darting nervously. "Make it romantic," he whispers. The scribe smirks and adds a line comparing her hair to spun gold, then another about her laugh causing the birds to pause mid-flight. Funny? Absolutely. Potential scandal? You bet. Imagine the lady reading this and blushing so hard her veil slips. Everyone notices, and suddenly your private admiration becomes a public spectacle. Scribes were often literate, clever, and well-versed in poetry. But they had limits. Some would insert playful riddles or odd metaphors that only the intended reader could decode. One surviving letter contains a line about the goose that dances beneath the cedar, and historians still debate whether it was a private joke, a flirtatious metaphor, or simply nonsense added by an amused scribe.
You can picture the poor knight receiving the response and spending days trying to decipher it, while the scribe laughs quietly in a corner. Then there's the small scandal when scribes overstepped. A few were caught adding embarrassing lines on their own, implying affection where none existed. You can almost hear the giggles echoing through the halls when a noblewoman's cousin reads aloud a note meant to be private, misinterpreting the scribe's exaggeration as actual sentiment. These tiny misadventures created miniature scandals, the kind that left people chuckling for weeks, though nobody admitted to reading the letters aloud. And sometimes, scribes carried letters between courts themselves. Picture a long journey on horseback, parchment tucked into a boot or stitched inside a cloak. Along the way, couriers could read lines silently, memorize phrases, and exaggerate details upon arrival. One letter praised a lady's charm so extravagantly that when the recipient finally read it, she laughed at the over-the-top descriptions. Tiny exaggerations could blossom into full-blown tales, with rumors adding their own embellishments. The scribe's hand shaped not only the words, but the scandal itself. Their playful interference, careful additions, and occasional errors could create blushes, laughter, and whispered rumors that echoed long after the letters were delivered. And as you imagine tracing these folded notes through the corridors, over stone floors and past watchful eyes, you see a secret network of romance thriving, held together by quill, ink, and human curiosity. You pause, listening to the imagined scratch of quills, the muffled laughter of servants, and the faint shuffle of velvet gowns on stone. The scribe's minor mischiefs, their tiny creative flourishes, and the occasional blunder all contributed to the slow, delicious drama that made courtly life both fascinating and lightly scandalous. Even a seemingly innocent love letter could become a ripple in the pond, touching every corner of the hall in whispers and laughter. You step into the private chambers of Lady Isolde, where sunlight filters lazily through small stained glass windows and the scent of lavender drifts from a brass basin. Here, the delicate art of replying to love letters takes center stage. It's not merely about answering, it's a game of balance, risk, and sometimes tiny rebellion. The lady weighs each word with care. A wrong phrase could offend her suitor, her family, or in some cases, the entire court. You notice her fingers hover over the parchment, hesitant, as if each quill stroke could shift the trajectory of her life. Noblewomen often faced the most delicate dilemmas. They were expected to maintain decorum, avoid impropriety, and yet respond to the clever advances of admirers. Some crafted replies in Latin, exuding erudition and restraint. Others preferred playful riddles or veiled flirtations, a gentle wink to the recipient while keeping the family and servants unaware. Historians still argue whether these coded replies were a form of empowerment or just another layer of social expectation. But either way, they required wit and courage. You imagine Lady Isolde responding to a note that read, "My heart beats like the drums at the castle gates whenever I see thee." She smiles, dips her quill, and adds a line about her favorite garden walk, carefully encoding the location so that only the intended knight could decode it. The servant assigned to deliver it waits patiently outside, oblivious to the tension in the room. The slightest rustle, a cough, or a dropped key could unravel the delicate secrecy. And then there's the humor in misunderstandings. One lady reportedly wrote a response praising a knight's steadfast courage, only for a rival to intercept and interpret it as romantic confession. The result? Laughter at the next banquet, whispers circulating like wildfire, and a small scandal that would have been remembered for weeks. Even a carefully crafted reply could ignite gossip if it fell into the wrong hands. Sometimes replies carried personal quirks like sketches of animals, simple rhymes, or tiny jokes referencing shared experiences. You can almost picture a lady doodling a rabbit, hopping across the margins while secretly signaling her amusement at a clumsy metaphor in the knight's letter. These little touches humanized the letters, added humor, and subtly tested the recipient's attentiveness. Yet the stakes remained high. One poorly worded reply could offend a jealous cousin or a wary father. Another could be misread by a servant, creating whispers about impropriety. And you realize as you watch this mental reenactment that each reply was a miniature performance, graceful, precise, and fraught with potential scandal. Even the most careful woman risked her reputation with every quill stroke. By the time her response was folded, sealed with a heart or family crest, and handed to a servant, it had already journeyed through a world of risk, humor, and delicate judgment. And though centuries later we read the letters with curiosity and amusement, at the time they were tiny acts of bravery, wit, and gentle rebellion against the rigid strictures of courtly life. The seemingly simple act of replying carried suspense, comedy, and the thrill of a scandal barely contained within folded parchment.
You followed the trail of letters into the castle garden, where the scent of roses and herbs mingles with the distant clatter of a blacksmith's hammer. This is where clandestine meetings often occurred, a physical extension of the coded messages you've been imagining. Lovers slipped through hedges and across cobblestone paths, carrying folded parchment close to their chests, each step heavy with anticipation and the faint risk of discovery. Historians still argue whether these garden rendezvous were more about romance or the thrill of flouting etiquette, but you can almost hear the whispered giggles echoing through the hedges. The gardens themselves were carefully designed for privacy and mischief. Labyrinthine hedges, hidden alcoves, and fountains served as natural screens. You imagine Lady Eleanor waiting beneath a trellis of jasmine, peering nervously around, while her suitor approaches, carefully avoiding the watchful eyes of patrolling servants. The very design of these spaces facilitated secrecy, as if the landscape itself conspired to allow romance to flourish. And here's a quirky detail. Some letters included subtle instructions about garden spots. Meet me where the sun first touches the fountain, or beneath the twisted oak, the third bench from the left. To an outsider, these were merely poetic flourishes. To the intended lover, they were precise coordinates. One misread instruction, recorded in a surviving anecdote, led a knight to wait for hours under the wrong tree, while the lady, having grown impatient, eventually returned home. The tiny scandal that ensued, the story of the knight and the wrong oak, circulated quietly among the court for weeks. You picture the playful tension, a hidden note exchanged at the base of a rosebush, a furtive hand extended to accept a folded reply. Sometimes these encounters were punctuated by whispered jokes or small teases, each one calculated to test the attentiveness of the other. Humor, after all, was a safe weapon in a world governed by strict rules. One misstep, a laugh too loud, a rustle of a gown, could alert the wrong eyes, transforming private affection into whispered gossip. Servants, again, played a critical role in these encounters. Some would quietly signal when the coast was clear, or deliver letters directly to secret meeting points. Others, caught between duty and curiosity, might peek, misplace a letter, or even leave behind a humorous annotation. One famous anecdote tells of a scribe adding a tiny doodle of a snail in the margin of a love note to mock the knight's tardiness, only for the lady to appreciate the humor and play along. Historians still debate whether this kind of playful interference was common or exceptional, but it highlights the delicate dance of secrecy, humor, and scandal in medieval courtship. And as you wander mentally through the fragrant paths, you notice the subtle thrill that pervades every exchange. The folded letters, the hidden alcoves, the coded phrases, they all converge here in the quiet intimacy of the garden. A glance, a whisper, a secret joke, each action, small as it seems, carries the weight of social expectation, potential gossip, and the sweet tension of forbidden affection. You lean against the rough stone wall of a garden, imagining the scene: a knight arriving late, a lady frowning playfully, a servant stifling a chuckle behind a hedge. Every misplaced word, every misread metaphor, every delayed reply could ripple outward, creating tiny scandals that amused and intrigued the court for weeks. And somehow, amid the risk and the whispered humor, love found its way, delicately, quietly, and always with the potential for scandal. You move now into the bustling hallways of the castle at dusk, where the golden light from torches flickers across stone walls, casting elongated shadows. This is the setting for another subtle but pervasive source of scandal: misdelivered letters. A folded note intended for one pair of eyes could accidentally end up in entirely the wrong hands. Historians still argue whether these mishaps were innocent errors, malicious diversions, or the result of distracted courtiers, but the consequences were often the same: whispered conversations and small, enduring scandals. Imagine a young page tasked with delivering a delicate letter from Lord Percival to Lady Matilda. The parchment slips from his hands as he navigates a crowded corridor. A rival noble intercepts it, reading out loud a passage meant to be private. Your smile outshines the moon at midnight. The words, innocent and poetic, suddenly spark a flurry of amused murmurs. The intended lady receives her note later, cheeks flushed not from passion but embarrassment. Then there were intentional pranks. Some courtiers, eager to entertain themselves, would intercept letters, alter a word or two, and slip them back into the hands of the sender or recipient. A line that originally read, "I long for your gentle touch," might become, "I long for your goatish touch," resulting in laughter and blushes throughout the hall. These small, playful alterations created a fertile ground for rumors and tiny scandals, illustrating that even in a structured medieval society, humor thrived in secret corners. Servants, too, often acted as unwilling participants in these mishaps. Some memorized parts of the correspondence, only to repeat it out loud later, inadvertently spreading gossip. Others hid letters in personal belongings, requiring frantic retrieval efforts. One chronicle amusingly describes a letter discovered in a basket of laundry, the words smeared with soap and water. The sender, naturally, insisted it had been read and mocked by several servants, creating a tiny ripple of scandal in the court. Historians still debate whether this kind of playful interference was common or exceptional, but it highlights the delicate dance of secrecy, humor, and scandal in medieval courtship. You also notice how the timing of delivery could amplify drama. A note arriving late, perhaps days after it was written, might reference events already concluded. The recipient, puzzled or amused, could misinterpret the meaning, while eavesdroppers gleefully speculate about secret trysts or miscommunications. Historians still debate how frequently these timing mishaps occurred, but the surviving anecdotes suggest they were far from rare. Even the tone of a letter, when misread, could fuel minor controversies. A playful metaphor intended to amuse could easily be interpreted as flirtation or insult, and every such misunderstanding offered ample opportunity for whispered gossip. You can imagine courtiers leaning against walls, sharing suppressed smiles as tales of misdelivered love spread through the castle like wildfire. And by the time you picture the chaos settling, the room quiet again, it's clear that the seemingly simple act of sending a letter was fraught with peril, humor, and intrigue. A single folded sheet of parchment could spark laughter, embarrassment, or curiosity, quietly weaving itself into the social fabric of the medieval court.
Huge shelves of leather-bound tomes rise like silent sentinels, and the scent of old paper mingles with beeswax. Here you encounter another layer of scandal: coded letters and secret alphabets. Lovers often disguise their words using simple ciphers or symbolic drawings to avoid detection by prying eyes. Historians still argue whether these codes were widely understood or intentionally obscured to heighten intrigue. But either way, they added a deliciously mischievous element to courtly correspondence. Picture a young nobleman, quill in hand, carefully substituting letters in a phrase so that only his beloved could decode it. "Meet me by the fountain at moonrise" might appear as a string of seemingly meaningless symbols. The thrill of secrecy, the risk of misinterpretation, and the tiny potential for scandal made every letter a delicate gamble. One misstep, and the message could fall into a rival's hands, causing amusement, confusion, or even minor social upheaval. Quirky details abound in these ciphers. Some lovers used pictograms, drawings of animals, celestial bodies, or household items, each carrying layered meanings. A rabbit could imply gentleness or swiftness. A crescent moon might symbolize longing or secrecy. One surviving letter features a cat with a curled tail, which historians still debate. Flirtation? A joke? Or a coded warning? The ambiguity only added to the courtly intrigue. Servants again played a critical role. They often acted as unwitting couriers of these cryptic notes. Some were literate enough to decode them and occasionally added comments in margins, a playful nudge or a sarcastic remark. Imagine the scandal when a servant's annotation accidentally reached the lady herself, prompting laughter or an eyebrow raise at the subversive humor. Timing, as ever, was essential. A misdelivered or delayed coded letter could transform private humor into public rumor. Courtiers might speculate endlessly about the meaning of symbols or unusual phrasing. One anecdote recounts a rival noble interpreting a playful cipher as evidence of clandestine plots, only to discover it simply outlined the path to the castle kitchen, a humorous misunderstanding that spread through the halls for weeks. And yet, these coded correspondences weren't purely playful. They allowed lovers to express emotions forbidden by strict court etiquette. A single symbol, carefully chosen, could convey longing, admiration, or even mild criticism without ever uttering a word aloud. The subtlety of these messages, combined with their vulnerability to misinterpretation, created a delicate tension, a slow, amusing dance between discretion and scandal. As you linger among the shelves, imagining hands tracing symbols, the whispered explanations, the laughter and blushes, it becomes clear that even the most innocuous-looking letter could carry layers of meaning, humor, and tiny scandal. In the medieval court, secrecy was both art and sport, a gentle thrill that enlivened otherwise rigid social life. You follow the trail into the castle's attic, a dusty, shadow-filled space where beams creak underfoot and sunlight barely penetrates the cobwebbed windows. Here, the aftermath of courtly correspondence often ended up. Letters abandoned, drafts crumpled, envelopes stuffed into corners. These discarded notes tell another story, the drama of discovery. Historians still argue whether abandoned letters were truly lost or deliberately hidden for mischief, but the surviving anecdotes suggest a playful, scandalous energy that lingered even after the ink had dried. Imagine a curious young page stumbling upon a bundle of half-written letters. The handwriting is familiar yet private, the words dripping with affection, embarrassment, and the occasional flirty metaphor. The page can't resist reading a few lines. A blush rises, a suppressed giggle escapes, and suddenly the intimate world of a noble couple is laid bare for an unexpected audience. One minor act of curiosity becomes a small scandal that echoes through the castle as whispers travel from hallway to hallway. Some letters, abandoned in trunks or beneath mattresses, revealed the creative lengths lovers went to maintain secrecy. Invisible ink made from lemon juice or milk hid the true content, only visible when heated by a candle. You can almost picture a servant accidentally discovering a message while tidying a room, holding the parchment too close to the fire and revealing a hidden declaration of love. Historians still debate whether this method was practical or primarily a playful novelty, but it certainly added suspense and occasional embarrassment to the exchange. Then there are letters used as bargaining chips. One anecdote tells of a noblewoman who stored her admirers' notes and used them strategically to tease rivals. A rival might be shown a particularly romantic line, only to blush furiously, unaware that it was never intended for them. The quiet manipulation of emotions through misdirected letters created tiny ripples of scandal, with laughter and speculation following in the corridors. You notice another detail. Sometimes scribes or servants deliberately altered, misfiled, or smudged letters to provoke confusion. A word changed here, a line shifted there, and suddenly a phrase of admiration turns into a humorous misstatement. Courtiers would joke about the accidental declarations that seemed to appear from nowhere, never suspecting the human hand behind the playful mischief. Even the mundane aspects, the choice of parchment, the type of ink, or the way the letter was folded contributed to the intrigue. Some letters arrived rolled, others folded with intricate patterns, signaling urgency, intimacy, or jest. Misinterpretation of these signals could provoke blushes, laughter, or whispered commentary, creating a delicate social ballet of humor, affection, and risk. As you linger among the attic shadows, imagining letters spilling from drawers, caught in spider webs, or secretly examined by curious eyes, you see that the world of medieval correspondence thrived on playful tension. Each note, each folded edge, each faintly visible symbol carried with it the potential for amusement, embarrassment, and the tiniest hint of scandal. In these quiet spaces, the private and the public dance delicately together, forming the subtle, endearing chaos of courtly love.
You move quietly through the grand banquet hall, now dim and empty after a day of feasting, and the echo of your footsteps seems unusually loud against the stone floor. Here, the interplay between love letters and courtly gossip becomes unmistakable. Servants, courtiers, and even visiting dignitaries were all keen observers of who exchanged notes with whom. One misdelivered line, a scribbled doodle or a playful metaphor, could spark whispers that circled the hall for weeks. Historians still debate whether such gossip truly influenced alliances or marriages, but its social power is undeniable. Picture Lady Marguerite folding a letter while glancing subtly toward her rival, a mischievous smile tugging at her lips. She had learned long ago that a carefully timed glance or a whispered comment could create intrigue without uttering a single incriminating word. And one surviving anecdote, a servant accidentally revealed that a nobleman had mentioned the softness of her gloves in a note, and suddenly the entire table erupted in quiet laughter. Tiny scandals like these were often more entertaining than the formal entertainments themselves. Even the mundane objects associated with letters could create humor or surprise. A wax seal might be broken prematurely, revealing a line intended for private eyes only. A ribbon might unravel, and the note inside would flutter in the breeze, landing in the wrong hands. One anecdote describes a letter that slipped from a windowsill during a windstorm, tumbling into the garden where rival suitors discovered it. The resulting embarrassment, chuckles, and whispered speculation became part of the courtly lore for months. You also notice the subtle artistry in how letters were presented. Some noblemen and women folded them in intricate patterns or included hidden compartments within the parchment. This practice not only safeguarded the message, but also signaled creativity and cleverness to the recipient. A playful fold or tiny doodle could indicate a private joke, a gentle tease, or a subtle test of attentiveness. Misinterpretation of these signals could produce blushes, laughter, or even small quarrels, a tiny scandal in miniature. Then there were the accidental readings. Sometimes a servant or attendant would glimpse a line while arranging objects or clearing a table, immediately sharing the amusing phrasing with friends. One tale recounts a scribe reading aloud a line about the moonlight dancing upon her slippers, prompting muffled laughter that traveled up to the highest balconies. The court learned quickly that humor and scandal could arise from the smallest oversight. Even the content of letters could escalate intrigue. One nobleman described a moonlit walk in the garden, complete with falling petals and a stolen glance, only to have his rival interpret it as an invitation to duel for attention,
Small poetic exaggerations, intended to charm, often became fodder for gossip and playful commentary. And you see now that in this elegant, carefully managed society, a single letter, handled improperly, read too eagerly, or misdelivered, could ripple outward, creating laughter, blushing, and a quietly thrilling sense of scandal that lingered long after the ink dried. You slip into a quiet corner of the castle, where the tapestries soften the echoes of your footsteps, and the distant murmur of the courtyard carries faintly through the stone walls. Here, the interplay between love letters and courtly gossip becomes unmistakable. Lovers often relied on invisible ink, cryptic symbols, and metaphor-laden phrasing to communicate. One misread symbol, a misinterpreted drawing, or an overly clever pun could generate weeks of whispered amusement or mild scandal among courtiers. Historians still debate whether such devices were primarily practical, playful, or an art form in themselves. But the intrigue is undeniable. Imagine a noblewoman receiving a note with tiny circles, triangles, and squiggles, each corresponding to words or phrases only she and the sender understood. A misstep in decoding might make her blush, laugh, or even deliver a response that unintentionally teased the wrong audience. In one amusing anecdote, a page misread a coded heart symbol as a literal darting bird, leading the recipient to believe the letter was about a pet rather than a secret meeting. The laughter that ensued among nearby courtiers became part of the gentle scandal. Courtiers often enhanced letters with playful riddles or references to shared experiences. One surviving message references a silver goose under the cedar, which historians still debate. Was it a flirtatious code, a subtle critique, or simply a joke between friends? The ambiguity of these symbols created opportunities for humorous misunderstandings. Even a rival nobleman might overhear part of the explanation, adding another ripple to the miniature scandal. Servants again played an unwitting role. They might memorize portions of letters, deliver messages late, or accidentally reveal the existence of correspondence. One record tells of a scribe who discovered a partially decoded message, misread it, and told the lady's cousin that her suitor intended to paint her shoes by moonlight. The cousin's bemused reaction, followed by suppressed laughter in the hall, illustrates how tiny errors could amplify amusement and minor gossip. You also notice the role of timing. A letter arriving days late could reference events that had already occurred, causing confusion or playful ribbing. Delayed or misread messages created tension, minor embarrassment, and opportunities for storytelling that persisted long after the original note was written. As you trace these letters in your imagination, the careful symbols, the playful misinterpretations, the small blushes and chuckles, you see a system where secrecy and code not just protected romance, but amplified it. Each letter carried layers of meaning, humor, and the potential for tiny scandals that rippled gently through the castle, leaving smiles, whispers, and quiet admiration in its wake.
You find yourself lingering near the castle's chapel, where the scent of incense mingles with the cool stone air, and the soft flicker of candlelight casts shadows that seem to move on their own. Even here, amidst devotion and solemnity, love letters occasionally caused tiny scandals. Courtiers would exchange notes during services, slipping folded parchments between pews or hiding them beneath hymnals. Historians still argue whether these gestures were daring acts of defiance, innocent amusement, or simply clever ways to communicate under strict watch, but the results were often quietly amusing and slightly scandalous. Imagine a young noblewoman passing a letter to her admirer under the pretense of kneeling to pray. The message, a short poem comparing her suitor's eyes to the flicker of candlelight, is received with stifled laughter. A nearby priest notices a subtle smile, raising an eyebrow, and later whispers to a fellow cleric about the curious behavior. No public rebuke occurs, but the tiny scandal, shared in whispers, echoes through the chapel for days. Some letters contained playful commentary on the sermon itself. A nobleman once wrote,
even the angels might blush at your wit, a line historians still debate as either flirtation or humorous exaggeration. Misinterpretations were common. A rival noble, reading over the shoulder of a servant delivering the note, might assume romantic intent where none existed, sparking quiet speculation that would circulate discreetly among peers. You can almost hear the muffled giggles and the rustle of robes as young lovers maneuver carefully to exchange messages. Sometimes a letter was hidden in a prayer book, sometimes tucked into the folds of a veil, or even fastened with a tiny ribbon to a rosary. Each method carried risk and opportunity for minor scandal, the suspense of discovery heightening the thrill. Then there were the cryptic rhymes designed for private amusement. Some correspondences included riddles, symbols, or allegorical references that only the intended recipient could decode. One anecdote describes a line referencing the fox beneath the altar, which historians still debate, a metaphor, a joke, or an intentional tease to spark curiosity. Whatever the original intent, whispers and chuckles inevitably followed, as courtiers speculated on the hidden meaning. Even in moments of apparent solemnity, humor and playfulness flourished. The careful balance of secrecy, wit, and small-scale intrigue made each letter more than a simple note. It became a miniature performance, a delicate dance of words and symbols that entertained, amused, and occasionally embarrassed. By the time the candles burned low and the last hymn faded, the chapel had witnessed tiny ripples of scandal, subtle amusement, and the quiet, enduring charm of courtly correspondence. You step now into the castle corridors at twilight, where shadows lengthen and the faint glow from torches flickers across the stone walls. This is where the final ripple of love letter scandals unfolds, the unintended audience. Even the most carefully folded note could be glimpsed by a servant, a page, or a curious noble passing by. Historians still argue whether these accidental sightings were common or exceptional, but the surviving tales suggest that tiny, humorous scandals were an everyday feature of courtly life. Picture a nobleman nervously clutching a folded letter, weaving through a hallway to deliver it to Lady Beatrice. A servant carrying a tray of fruit inadvertently bumps into him, dislodging the note from his grasp. It flutters to the floor, revealing a line about the moonlight catching your laughter like a silver bell. Nearby courtiers spot the phrase, exchange knowing glances, and quietly chuckle. The letter eventually reaches its intended recipient, but the whispered amusement lingers long afterward. Sometimes the humor escalated into full-blown misunderstandings. A playful metaphor, a joke about a garden bench, or a reference to a shared experience could be misconstrued by eavesdroppers. One anecdote recounts a servant interpreting a coded phrase about a wandering fox as a literal accusation, sparking laughter and whispered commentary among the castle's staff. These minor incidents created what we might call micro-scandals, small enough to amuse without disrupting social order, yet vivid enough to be remembered for weeks. Letters were not always serious or romantic. Some contained subtle critiques of behavior, playful teasing, or clever observations meant only for the recipient's eyes. When intercepted or partially revealed, these notes could unintentionally embarrass both sender and recipient, generating gentle humor and whispered gossip. You can almost hear the suppressed laughter echoing through hallways, the slight blushes on faces, and the quick, careful retrieval of papers before any further mischief ensues. Even the most mundane delivery methods, folding, sealing, or tucking into clothing, could contribute to scandal. One record tells of a letter hidden in a sleeve slipping out during a dance, eliciting stifled giggles from onlookers. The combination of timing, human curiosity, and social observation ensured that every small act of correspondence carried with it the potential for entertainment, gentle embarrassment, and minor intrigue. By the time the candles burned low and the last hymn faded, the chapel had witnessed tiny ripples of scandal, subtle amusement, and the quiet, enduring charm of courtly correspondence. As the last torches flicker and the corridors fall into quiet shadow, you can feel the weight of centuries settling softly around you. The rustle of parchment, the scratch of quills, and the whispers of playful scandal fade into a gentle rhythm, like the slow, steady ticking of a clock in an empty hall. You imagine the castle at night, gardens silent, halls empty, and lovers' letters safely tucked away, holding the secrets, jokes, and tiny blushes that once brought such vivid life to its stone walls. Even now, the human pulse of humor, curiosity, and affection seems to linger in these spaces. Tiny scandals, once the source of whispered amusement, now soften into gentle stories, playful echoes from a past that seems almost dreamlike. You can picture the soft sighs of relief when letters reach their intended recipients, the quiet smiles exchanged in corners, and the delicate balance of secrecy and trust that made courtly life both exciting and comforting in its own peculiar way. And as you trace the path of each note, each secret message, each subtle joke, you realize that these moments were more than mischief. They were expressions of human connection, creativity, and care. Every folded sheet of parchment, every coded symbol, every playful exaggeration was a small gesture of affection, a tiny rebellion against rigid etiquette, and a spark of delight in a carefully ordered world. So let yourself drift now with these stories, imagining the rustle of letters, the soft laughter, and the hidden smiles of the past. Allow the gentle intrigue, the subtle humor, and the delicate charm of medieval love letters to guide you into calmness. Let your mind wander along candlelit corridors, through secret gardens, and past whispering halls. Now relax your shoulders, soften your breathing, and let the centuries of quiet romance and tiny scandal lull you into a peaceful, gentle slumber.